Sometimes the most profound connections begin not with words, but with the courage to be completely vulnerable with a stranger who chooses to catch you when you fall. The rain tapped against the windows of apartment 4B as David sat hunched over his laptop, the blue light casting shadows across his tired face. 6 months had passed since he'd moved into this quiet building, and he still felt like a ghost wandering through someone else's life. His graphic design work kept him busy, but not busy enough to forget. The empty coffee mug beside him had been there since morning, a reminder of how the days blended together when you lived alone. He'd chosen this place specifically because it was quiet, because he needed space to heal, because starting over meant starting somewhere new. The breakup with his ex-girlfriend had been one of those slow, painful endings that dragged on for months, not the kind where someone cheats or lies, but the worst kind where two people just slowly realize they want different things. She wanted marriage and kids right away. He wanted to figure out who he was first. Neither was wrong, but neither could bend, so here he was, living in a one-bedroom apartment with cream-colored walls and a view of the parking lot, trying to rebuild a life that felt authentic. The footsteps started again. David had grown used to the sound over the past few months. Someone lived directly above him, and their schedule was completely opposite to his. While he worked during the day, they seemed to move around at night. While he slept, they were quiet as a mouse. He'd seen her a few times in the hallway. A woman about his age, maybe a little younger, with dark hair usually pulled back in a messy bun. She always wore scrubs, the kind nurses wear, and she always looked exhausted. Not just tired from a long day, but that bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying too much weight on your shoulders. They'd exchanged polite nods, the kind neighbors give each other when they're not sure if they should try to be friendly or just mind their own business. David had almost said hello a few times, but she always seemed to be in a hurry, keys jingling as she rushed up the stairs to apartment 5B. Tonight, the footsteps sounded different. Usually they were purposeful, someone going from point A to point B. Tonight they seemed to wander, back and forth across the floor above like someone pacing. David tried to focus on his work. He was designing a logo for a local bakery, trying to capture the feeling of warmth and home in simple lines and colors. But the pacing continued, and despite himself he found his attention drifting upward. He didn't know anything about his upstairs neighbor, except that she worked in healthcare and kept odd hours. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, had mentioned once that the woman in 5B worked at the hospital downtown. Night shifts, she'd said, shaking her head sympathetically. Those are hard on a person. The pacing stopped suddenly, replaced by a sound that made David's stomach tighten. It was soft, almost muffled, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. David stared at his laptop screen without seeing it. The crying wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind of crying someone does when they think no one can hear, when they finally let themselves fall apart in the privacy of their own space. He felt awkward listening, like he was intruding on something private. But the thin walls of the old building made privacy impossible. He'd heard her alarm go off at strange hours, heard her shower running at 5 a.m, heard her footsteps rushing out the door. These were the sounds of someone else's life, and now he was hearing something much more personal. The crying continued for maybe 10 minutes, though it felt longer. Then, silence. David waited, expecting to hear movement. Maybe the sound of her getting ready for bed or making tea or doing any of the normal things people do after they've had a good cry. Instead, there was nothing. Complete heavy silence that felt different from the usual quiet of the building at night. He saved his work and closed his laptop, suddenly unable to concentrate. The silence from upstairs felt wrong somehow, like the pause before something breaks. David had always been the type of person who worried about others. His ex-girlfriend used to tease him about it, how he'd check on elderly neighbors during snowstorms or help strangers with flat tires. It was part of what made him good at his job, this ability to think about what other people needed. But it also meant he couldn't easily ignore when someone seemed to be struggling. He went to his kitchen and made 2 cups of tea, telling himself he was just being prepared. If he heard sounds of normal activity from upstairs, he'd drink both cups himself and call it a night. But if the silence continued, maybe he'd work up the courage to check on his neighbor. The minutes ticked by. Still no sound from apartment 5B. David stood at his kitchen counter holding his warm mug, looking at the second cup of tea growing cool. This was the kind of moment that felt significant later, though you never know it at the time. The kind of small decision that changes everything. He could mind his own business. She was a stranger after all, and maybe she just wanted to be left alone. Maybe she'd fallen asleep and the crying was just someone having a bad night. Everyone had those, but what if it was more than that? What if she was in trouble or sick or hurt? David had learned something about loneliness in the past 6 months. It wasn't just about being alone. You could be alone and perfectly content. Loneliness was about feeling like no one would notice if you disappeared, like your struggles were yours to carry without help. He'd felt that way plenty of times since his breakup. Not because he didn't have friends or family, but because starting over meant that all your daily struggles were private again. No one to notice when you had a bad day. No one to bring you soup when you felt sick. No one to worry when you were late coming home. The silence from upstairs continued, and David made his decision. He climbed the stairs to the 5th floor, his heart beating faster with each step. The hallway was dimly lit by fluorescent lights that hummed quietly. Apartment 5B was at the end of the hall, and as he approached, he could see light seeping out from under the door. David raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What would he say? "Hi, I heard you crying and wanted to make sure you're okay." That sounded creepy. "Hi, I brought you tea." That sounded presumptuous. Before he could change his mind, he knocked softly on the door. 3 gentle taps that seemed loud in the quiet hallway. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then he heard footsteps, slow and hesitant, approaching the door. This was how it started. Not with grand gestures or dramatic meetings, but with a simple act of human concern. One neighbor checking on another. 2 people who were about to discover that sometimes the connections we need most come from the most unexpected places. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door, and David waited, holding his breath for whatever came next. The door opened just a crack, and David found himself looking into the tired eyes of his upstairs neighbor. She was still in her scrubs, her hair falling out of what had probably been a neat ponytail hours earlier. Her eyes were red, but she'd clearly tried to compose herself before answering the door. "Hi," David said softly, suddenly feeling foolish. "I'm David from downstairs. I was wondering if you're okay." She stared at him for a moment, and he could see her calculating whether to trust this stranger with whatever was happening in her life. Finally, she opened the door a little wider. "I'm Lisa," she said, her voice hoarse. "And honestly, no, I'm not really okay." That conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but it changed everything. David learned that Lisa worked as a nurse at the downtown hospital, pulling 12-hour night shifts that left her exhausted and emotionally drained. She'd been dealing with some personal stuff, she said vaguely, and sometimes the weight of it all just caught up with her. David offered her the tea he'd brought, and for a moment she almost smiled. Almost. "Thank you," she said. "That's really kind. But I should probably try to get some sleep before my next shift." After that night, David became more aware of the sounds from upstairs. Not in a nosy way, but in the way you notice things about people you care about. He learned that Lisa left for work every evening at 6 sharp, her footsteps quick and purposeful as she headed down the hallway. He learned that she came home around 7 in the morning, sometimes earlier if she'd had a particularly rough night. He started timing his own schedule around hers, not consciously at first. He'd find himself making coffee right around the time she got home, or checking his mail when he knew she'd be leaving for work. They'd nod to each other in the hallway, sometimes exchange a few words about the weather or the broken elevator. Lisa was dealing with more than just work stress, though David didn't know the details yet. Her mother had been battling a serious illness for months, and Lisa spent most of her free time either at the hospital where she worked or at the different hospital where her mother was a patient. The guilt of not being able to do more ate away at her constantly. Then there was her ex-fiancé, Kevin. They'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 6 months. When he decided he couldn't handle her schedule anymore, he wanted a wife who'd be home for dinner, who could attend his work events, who wasn't always exhausted or worried about someone else. The breakup had been messy and painful, made worse by the fact that Kevin kept calling, texting, showing up at her apartment. He'd convinced himself that if he just waited long enough, she'd realize she was making a mistake and come back to him. Lisa threw herself into work even harder, picking up extra shifts, volunteering for the most difficult cases. It was easier than going home to an empty apartment where Kevin's things used to be. Easier than sitting with her own thoughts. but exhaustion has a way of catching up with you. 3 weeks after their first real conversation, David was working late when he heard the familiar sound of Lisa's key in her lock upstairs. But instead of the usual quick footsteps across her floor, he heard something that made him pause. The key had broken. David opened his door and found Lisa in the hallway, holding the broken half of her key, staring at her door like it had personally betrayed her. She looked like she was about to cry again, and David realized this was probably the last thing she needed after what had clearly been a difficult shift. "Rough night?" he asked gently. Lisa laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's one way to put it. We lost a patient tonight, 23 years old. Car accident." She held up the broken key. "And now this." David didn't hesitate. "Come on," he said, opening his door wider. "Let's call the building manager and get you some coffee while we wait." This time Lisa didn't hesitate either. She followed him into his apartment, collapsing onto his couch like all the energy had left her body at once. "I don't usually fall apart like this," she said, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. "I'm supposed to be the strong one, you know. At work, with my mom, with everyone." David sat down in the chair across from her, giving her space but staying close enough to listen. "Being strong all the time is exhausting," he said. "I learned that the hard way." Over the next hour, while they waited for the building manager to arrive with a spare key, Lisa and David talked in a way that felt surprisingly natural. She told him about her mother's illness, about the pressure she felt to be perfect at work when people's lives depended on her. She mentioned her ex-fiancé, though she didn't go into details. David shared his own story about his breakup, about learning to live alone again, about the strange loneliness of starting over in your late 20s, when everyone else seemed to have their lives figured out. When the building manager finally arrived and Lisa was able to get into her apartment, she paused at David's door. "Thank you," she said, "for the coffee, for listening, for not making me feel weird about falling apart in front of a stranger." "You're not a stranger," David replied. "You're my upstairs neighbor who makes terrible coffee and watches old movies too loud on Thursday nights." Lisa actually smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. "How do you know my coffee is terrible?" "The smell travels through the vents," David grinned. "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone." After that night, their hallway conversations became longer. David would sometimes leave for his morning jog right when Lisa was getting home, and they'd chat for a few minutes about their plans for the day. Lisa started knocking on his door when she had weird work schedules, asking if he needed anything from the store since she was going anyway. It was the kind of friendship that develops slowly between people who understand each other's need for space, while also craving connection. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late October. David was editing photos for a client when he heard Lisa's phone ringing upstairs. Not unusual, except it kept ringing and ringing. Finally, he heard her answer, and even through the floor he could hear that something was very wrong. Lisa had been at the hospital all night, working a particularly difficult shift in the emergency room. She was exhausted, running on her third cup of coffee and sheer willpower, when her own phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was her mother's doctor. Her mother had taken a turn for the worse during the night and had been rushed into emergency surgery. The doctors weren't sure she would make it. Lisa drove across town to the other hospital in a daze, still wearing her scrubs from her own shift. She spent the next 16 hours in uncomfortable waiting room chairs, drinking bad coffee and watching the clock move impossibly slowly. Her mother did survive the surgery, but barely. The doctors said the next few days would be critical, and someone should stay with her as much as possible. Lisa called in sick to her own job and settled in for what she knew would be a long vigil. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 24 hours. She hadn't slept in over 36 hours, but she couldn't leave her mother's side. That's when Kevin showed up. Lisa's ex-fiancé had somehow heard about her mother's condition, probably through mutual friends, and he arrived at the hospital carrying flowers and wearing his most sympathetic expression. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, settling into the chair next to hers like he belonged there. "You don't have to go through this alone." Under normal circumstances, Lisa might have appreciated the gesture, or at least been polite about it. But she was running on empty, emotionally and physically, and Kevin's presence felt like one more thing she had to manage. "I'm fine," she told him. "You don't need to be here." But Kevin wasn't taking the hint. He'd been waiting for an opportunity like this, a crisis that would prove to Lisa how much she needed him. He started talking about how they could work things out, how he understood now that her job was important to her, how they could find a compromise. "This is exactly why we should be together," he said, reaching for her hand. "You're trying to handle everything by yourself, but you don't have to. I can take care of you." Lisa pulled her hand away. "I don't need you to take care of me, Kevin. I need you to respect that I can handle my own life." But Kevin persisted. He stayed at the hospital for hours despite Lisa's obvious discomfort. He brought her food she didn't want and offered advice she didn't ask for. When visiting hours ended and Lisa had to leave, he followed her to the parking lot. "Come stay at my place tonight," he said. "You shouldn't be alone right now." "I want to be alone," Lisa replied, but Kevin acted like he hadn't heard her. "You're not thinking clearly," he continued. "You're exhausted and scared, and you're not making good decisions. This whole thing with your mom just proves that you can't handle everything by yourself." That's when Lisa lost it. "Get away from me," she said, her voice shaking with anger and exhaustion. "I told you we're done, Kevin. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Stop showing up, stop calling, stop acting like you know what's best for me." Kevin's sympathetic mask slipped for a moment, revealing something uglier underneath. "You'll regret this," he said. "When you're sitting alone in that apartment with no one to help you, you'll remember that I was here when you needed someone." Lisa drove home in a fog of exhaustion and emotion. She'd been strong for her colleagues all night, strong for her mother all day, and now she'd had to be strong enough to stand up to Kevin too. She felt like she'd used up every ounce of strength she had. When she reached her apartment building, she sat in her car for a long time, too tired to move. She thought about going upstairs to her empty apartment, about microwaving some leftover takeout and falling into bed, about waking up in a few hours to do it all over again. The thought of that emptiness, that silence, felt unbearable. Lisa looked up at the building and saw that the lights were still on in apartment 4B. David was awake, probably working late like he often did. She thought about their conversation a few weeks ago, about how he'd listened without trying to fix everything, about how he'd made her feel less alone without making her feel weak. She thought about Kevin's words about needing someone, about not being able to handle things alone. Maybe he was right about needing people, even if he was wrong about everything else. Lisa got out of her car and walked into the building. But instead of going up to the 5th floor, she stopped at the 4th. She stood outside apartment 4B for a long moment, gathering courage she didn't know she still had. Then she knocked on David's door. David opened his door to find Lisa standing in the hallway, and he immediately knew something was very wrong. She looked like she'd been through a battle. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair was a mess, and her eyes held that hollow look of someone who had reached their absolute limit. "Lisa?" he said softly. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before, vulnerable and desperate, but also determined. Without saying a word, she stepped into his apartment. David closed the door behind her and turned around to find her standing in the middle of his living room, just breathing. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept running them through her hair like she was trying to hold herself together. "My mom," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She almost died today. Surgery. I've been at the hospital for 18 hours. David felt his heart clench. "Lisa, I'm so sorry. Is she okay now?" "She's stable," Lisa replied, but her voice cracked on the words. "The doctors say she'll probably be fine, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being the strong one all the time." David moved closer, wanting to comfort her but not sure how. "You don't have to be strong right now. Not here." That's when Lisa broke down completely. All the tears she'd held back at the hospital, all the fear and exhaustion she'd been carrying for months came pouring out. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed in a way that sounded like it came from somewhere deep inside her soul. David didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her, letting her cry against his chest. She felt so small in his arms, this woman who spent her days taking care of everyone else, finally letting someone take care of her. They stood like that for a long time, Lisa crying and David just holding her, not trying to fix anything or say the right words. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is just to be present with them in their pain. When the tears finally slowed, Lisa pulled back slightly, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to fall apart like that." "You have nothing to apologize for," David said firmly. When was the last time you slept? Or ate something? Lisa thought about it and realized she couldn't remember. I don't know. Yesterday, maybe? David guided her to his couch and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, simple comfort food that wouldn't upset her stomach. I'm not really hungry, Lisa protested, but David sat down beside her and gave her a look that said he wasn't taking no for an answer. Eat, he said gently. Your body needs fuel, even if your mind doesn't want it. As Lisa ate, she told him everything. About her mother's emergency surgery, about spending hours in the waiting room not knowing if she'd ever see her mom alive again, about Kevin showing up and making everything worse with his demands and manipulation. He kept saying I needed someone to take care of me, Lisa said, her voice getting angry, like I'm some helpless person who can't handle her own life. He made my mother's crisis about our relationship. David listened without judgment, letting her get all of it out. When she finished talking, they sat in comfortable silence for a while. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of rain against the windows. I don't want to go back to my apartment tonight, Lisa said suddenly. I can't face that emptiness right now. Then don't, David replied simply. Stay here. Lisa looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her feel safer than she had in months. Not the possessive concern that Kevin had shown, but genuine care without any expectation attached to it. Are you sure? She asked. I'm sure, David said. You can take my bed and I'll sleep on the couch. Or we can both sleep on the couch if you don't want to be alone. Whatever you need. Lisa felt something shift inside her chest. For months, she'd been surrounded by people who wanted things from her. Her job wanted her energy and expertise. Her mother needed her care and support. Kevin wanted her to be someone she wasn't. But here was David, offering comfort without asking for anything in return. I don't want to be alone, she admitted quietly. So they settled on the couch together, David at one end and Lisa curled up at the other end with her feet tucked under her. David found an old movie on TV, something light and familiar that didn't require much attention. But Lisa wasn't really watching the movie. She was watching David, this kind man who had opened his door at midnight without question, who had fed her and listened to her and offered her exactly what she needed, without making her feel weak for needing it. Somewhere during the movie, Lisa moved closer to him on the couch. Not in a romantic way, but like a person seeking warmth and comfort. David welcomed her without making it awkward or complicated, just adjusting his position so she could lean against him more comfortably. Thank you, Lisa whispered against his shoulder, for this, for not trying to fix everything or tell me what I should do. You don't need fixing, David replied, his voice soft in the darkened room. You just needed someone to see that you're human too. They fell asleep like that, Lisa's head on David's shoulder and his arm around her protectively. It wasn't about romance or attraction, though both of them felt the potential for something deeper. It was about two people who had learned to be alone, finding comfort in not being alone, just for one night. When the morning sun started filtering through the windows, Lisa woke up first. For a moment she was disoriented, not remembering where she was. Then she saw David's peaceful sleeping face and remembered everything that had happened. She felt different somehow. Not completely healed from her exhaustion and grief, but less fragile, like she'd remembered something important about herself that she'd forgotten somewhere along the way. David woke up to the smell of coffee and something that might have been pancakes. For a moment he was confused, forgetting that Lisa had stayed the night. Then he remembered everything and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with romantic feelings, and everything to do with the simple pleasure of helping someone he cared about. He found Lisa in his kitchen looking more rested than she had in weeks. She'd borrowed one of his old college t-shirts and a pair of his sweatpants, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked younger somehow, less burdened. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing at the stove. I found some pancake mix in your cupboard, and I figured it was the least I could do after you let me fall apart in your living room. You didn't fall apart, David said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. You finally let yourself feel what you'd been holding in for months. There's a difference. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, both of them processing what had happened between them. It hadn't been romantic, but it had been intimate in a different way. They'd seen each other at their most vulnerable, and had responded with kindness and understanding. I should probably check on my mom, Lisa said eventually, though she didn't seem eager to leave. Of course, David agreed. But Lisa, can I ask you something? She nodded, looking at him over her coffee mug. What do you want? David asked. Not what your mom needs or what your job requires or what Kevin thinks you should want. What do you actually want for yourself? Lisa was quiet for a long time, considering the question. I want to feel like myself again, she said finally. I want to remember what it feels like to be happy, not just responsible. I want to have relationships that don't drain me dry. Those sound like reasonable things to want, David said gently. Kevin used to say I was selfish for putting my career first, Lisa continued. But it wasn't about choosing work over him. It was about not losing myself completely in someone else's idea of who I should be. David nodded, understanding completely. My ex wanted me to be ready for marriage and kids right away, and when I said I needed more time to figure out who I was, she acted like I was just being immature. But sometimes knowing yourself takes time. They talked for another hour, sharing stories about their past relationships, their hopes for the future, their fears about being alone versus their fears about being with the wrong person. It was the kind of conversation that usually takes months to have with someone, but their shared night of vulnerability had fast-tracked their emotional intimacy. I should probably set some boundaries with Kevin, Lisa said eventually. Real ones this time. Maybe even get a restraining order if he keeps showing up places. You deserve to feel safe, David agreed. And you deserve to make your own choices without someone pressuring you. When Lisa finally left to go check on her mother, she paused at David's door. Would you like to have dinner sometime? She asked. Like a real dinner where we both dress like adults and talk about something other than our emotional baggage? David smiled. I'd like that very much. Over the following weeks, Lisa and David began building something new together. Not the desperate clinging of two lonely people, but the careful, intentional construction of two people who had learned to be whole on their own and were choosing to share that wholeness with each other. Lisa's mother recovered slowly but steadily, and Lisa learned to balance caring for her with caring for herself. She picked up fewer extra shifts at work and started sleeping regular hours when possible. She even started seeing a counselor to help her process all the changes in her life. Kevin tried to contact her a few more times, but Lisa held firm to her boundaries. She changed her phone number, told building security not to let him in, and made it clear to mutual friends that she didn't want any information about her past along to him. David supported her through all of this without trying to control or manage her decisions. He listened when she needed to talk, gave her space when she needed to think, and slowly, carefully, let their relationship develop into something beautiful and healthy. 6 months later, David was working late in his apartment when he heard familiar footsteps upstairs. But this time the sound made him smile instead of worry. He knew those footsteps belonged to someone he cared about, someone who had taught him that true intimacy isn't about possession or need, but about two people choosing to be vulnerable with each other and responding to that vulnerability with kindness. Lisa knocked on his door, and when he opened it, she was holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. I thought you might need a break from work, she said. Perfect timing, David replied, stepping aside to let her in. I was just thinking about you. They settled on his couch together, the same couch where they'd slept that first night when Lisa was falling apart. But now they were here by choice, not desperation. Two people who had found their way to each other through crisis and stayed together through healing. I love you, Lisa said quietly, the words feeling both natural and momentous. I love you too, David replied, and meant it completely. Outside, it started to rain again, the same gentle sound that had provided the soundtrack to their beginning. But this time, neither of them was crying. This time, they were just two people who had learned that sometimes the most important connections happen when we're brave enough to be completely honest about needing help, and lucky enough to find someone who responds with exactly the right kind of love.